Welcome to Saltgrass, a show about how local communities can engage with the climate crisis at a grassroots level. My name is Ali Hanley, and in this episode we're talking about democracy. It seems fitting. We have a federal election just a couple of weeks away, and as I've said before in this show, I started this program in a large part out of frustration about our federal government and the ways that they're actively supporting fossil fuel industries and they're delaying making any real or sensible commitments to climate action. So a federal election is a key opportunity to change the guard, to get a different crew in office and see if they won't take stronger action on our behalf. But of course, democracy is complicated, and we could spend many episodes talking about the nature of our political system and what power we as individuals really have in that system. We could also spend episodes talking to local candidates and talking to federal politicians. I'm not going to do any of that, not right now anyway. I thought I would explore some of these things in a future episode or two, but today I'm going to be chatting with Castlemaine local Bryn Davies and a group he has been a part of called Democracy For Dinner. I thought this was a suitable topic to talk about because we're actually going to unpack some of the fundamentals of what our Australian democracy is about. And it's a very pleasant sounding enterprise, Democracy For Dinner. And it's also an example, this group that he has been a part of how we can, in our local regions, get together in a grassroots kind of way and start to take it upon ourselves to understand all of the political system and what's really going on with its complexities and difficulties and opportunities. Because just like with climate change, it's easy to feel that federal politics is way too big and beyond our control. And it's really important that we don't feel that way and that we actually engage with it. If you live in Castlemaine, I highly recommend that you check out the Meet the Candidates event happening on Wednesday, the 11th of May. It's at the Tap Room and it's been run by the people in Democracy For Dinner. And hopefully, if there's a recording available after the event, I will link it in the episode notes of the podcast. So stay tuned for that. But if you wanted to, you can either go in person to the Tap Room on Wednesday the 11th, or you can live stream, I believe. Last time they live streamed, so hopefully they'll do that again. And of course, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Bryn and I recorded this episode on Jarrah country, the traditional home of the Dja Dja Wurrung, who have been custodians and caretakers of this land for tens of thousands of years. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.
So I'm Bryn. I live in Castlemaine on Jarrah country. So I'll pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and a continuing connection to this land. So thanks for having me on. So who I am and my interest in democracy, how I got to that. I think I've always had an interest in democracy. In fact, there's a bit of a story that when I was 15, my brother didn't want to vote in the federal election. So I walked down and said I was him and voted. So there's probably some election back in the 90s that is fraudulent, at least for one vote, because of that. And I just, found it sort of fascinating from that kind of perspective of, elections. Some people find elections fascinating and exciting, like horse race sport
Spectator
contest,
sport.
sort of thing, and others find it a big turn off. And I guess for me, as I've grown older, I've kind of realised that the spectator sport is part of what's really wrong about democracy and voting and elections. And, we can talk about polarisation and things that come from that. So in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, I've been involved with a local Castlemaine group called Democracy For Dinner, which started as an idea to spread the burden of being an informed citizen. It actually takes a bit of work to be well enough informed to vote in a democracy. We need people to be educated, we need people to take an interest for the system to work. It's particularly challenging at a local level where candidates aren't always as well known. So it was a friend of mine, Jodie's original idea, and Lexi, Jodie and I got together and organised a dinner for democracy. We invited about 15 or 20 people who took a different angle on the election and came and shared their knowledge across the group. And so that evolved into a regular monthly-ish meeting where we discuss a different topic related to democracy and events. And we run things like Meet the Candidates, that sort of thing, to give people access to what's going on and good understanding to inform them before they vote.
Yeah, great. And so when you first had that very first dinner, did you consciously invite people who had different political viewpoints to come along to sort of broaden everyone's horizons, or did you just grab a bunch of people that you thought would be interested and just get this conversation started?
Yeah, I don't think we had the luxury of hundreds of people wanting to come, and therefore we could select a representative sample like you would on Q&A or something. But we had a pretty good interest. I think, like I said, 15 to 20, it might have been 25 people there in the end. But what we did do is we asked them all to come with 3 different perspectives on the topic that they had researched. So it was looking at essentially what's the Labor policy, what's the Liberal policy, and what's the Greens policy as 3 perspectives. And we have our own opinions and our own kind of viewpoints, but one of the things that we find really important in the conversations we have, around the dinner table, and that I think relates to democracy generally, is keeping an open mind and listening to the best possible viewpoint from the other side. The challenge is being closed-minded to what might be the other side and dismissive of it doesn't help any of us and doesn't help democracy. So we brought different perspectives and we sort of debated them, and we tried to listen to what was the best possible version of the side that we didn't necessarily agree with. And in each of the dinners that we've had since, I mean, the thing I really like about them, in addition to they're sort of an intentional space where you can talk about stuff, as opposed to a dinner party where you might talk for a few seconds and it feels uncomfortable going too far, or you get into an argument. This is
don't bring
one
up politics.
topic.
It's like that's the rule of a dinner party.
That's right. This is the
politics.
opposite. Like, you can't talk about anything else. And it gives, you actually get to the point where you do learn something every time. And that's the thing I find really valuable, is that you talk about something for long enough that you always come away with a different perspective or something different that you've learned out of the process. And not everyone has the luxury or the interest in doing that. And so we do, try to do things like Meet the Candidates and that kind of stuff, which is a little bit more widely accessible. But it all has the same principle of, listening, informing ourselves and being engaged citizens.
And obviously before the pandemic, you were able to do this in a room and have lots of people sitting at close quarters and listening to each other. How did it grow in the first couple of years before the pandemic?
Yeah, so we didn't ever have the kind of 25 people with 3 portfolios as the model going forward. It was quite an intensive exercise, a lot of fun. People dressed up. We had name tags, Minister for X, and it was a lot of fun. I still got all those name tags in a box somewhere. But it then evolved into, we would select a topic, and either we'd have someone from the group who was interested in it, or we started then inviting, knowledgeable people from outside the group to come and lead a discussion, and then just spend, it usually started around 7, you'd be exhausted by about 9:30, so a couple of hours talking about that topic. So we'd cover education, we covered climate change, identity politics, healthcare, a whole range of different things. We had a friend who works in energy policy talking about nuclear. Is nuclear an option to solve climate change at one stage? Some things that sort of are asking challenging questions, and that's one that you can have a fairly visceral reaction to whatever perspective you're coming from, but it's a different thing to actually stop and think about it as, what is the pluses and minuses here? How do we work through it? And how do you weigh up the risks in that example of nuclear energy versus the impending climate crisis? So it's not as easy a thing.
The potential apocalypse is worse.
That's right. And you can actually, on nuclear energy, I mean, you can measure some of these things, like the level of risk, and we've got, so you can actually do, not that we have all the data in front of us, but at least it's turning our minds to that kind of thing. We had a really interesting discussion on refugees once where, and this is going to sound controversial, but I remember the thing that I came away with was like, actually stopping the boats is not a bad idea. And I was like, I hadn't realized that before. Not because we don't want people to come here, because it's actually a really crap way to get here. Like, it's dangerous for everybody and they're getting ripped off and it's horrible. Like, we need a different solution to giving refuge to people who need it than having them come across. So it was just interesting to have those sorts of things, put to us in a way that you can easily say, I don't believe in that without having thought about it in a detailed way. Can you have a more humane way of, settling refugees and that kind of thing? So they're the sort of things that come out of the conversations that we find really valuable.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like often a lot of people in Australia, because it's compulsory to vote here, we all just show up for a democracy sausage once every 3 years. And a lot of people don't think about what democracy is or what our democracy specifically is. And a lot of people passively consume their news sources. They don't necessarily think about who they're consuming the news from or how that impacts how they understand particular issues.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious, do you feel like most of the people who participated, were people sometimes surprised at what they got from it? And do you feel like there was a collective kind of consciousness raising almost, isn't it? It's a consciousness raising group in a way.
Look, I think at times that there certainly was. I mean, that's like I said, my personal experience of it was, that I would learn something each time. I think so. I mean, it really is up to the individual, like whether they, are doing the work to keep their mind sufficiently open, but, not so wide open that your brain falls out. There are definitely times where I feel like we've had really interesting collective discussions that have got us to a point that feels really unique and different, like a conversation we had about local democracy and local government and the importance of that, the challenge of getting good candidates in. And, we ended up at the end of it, didn't quite happen in the end, and maybe it will one day, but it was talking about models like, the lottery model for election. Could we just get 100 people to run and 100 people picked at random, which it's a model that's existed since the Greeks, actually, the lottery model. And, some people call it the Ricky Muir model in Australia, where motoring enthusiast party guy got elected on hardly a handful of votes plus a really well done preferences, but became quite an interesting character because he didn't know anything about what he was going in there for, had no fixed views, and spent his time learning and listening and talking to people, which if you just picked 100 people at random, maybe that's what would happen. So we came away with this really different way of thinking about how you would get people into local government. And we did a fair bit of work at the beginning of sort of 2020 to try to encourage candidates for local government election. The pandemic got in the way of a lot of the effort there in the end. It was pretty challenging, but we did quite a bit to sort of engage with those candidates that did run and put up a survey and a blog on their views, that kind of thing.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Like local government or local council is such a different thing to state or federal politics in terms of who the people you're going to get involved and what their sense of responsibility is to their community. Most career politicians are they've spent their entire life priming for that moment, and they get slammed by the rest of the political kind of arena if they don't have a really watertight position.
I mean, there's a couple of things in what you're saying. I mean, just the difficulty putting yourself up for public office and the environment that you then end up in and how that's not particularly attractive. I mean, that's a fundamental flaw in a democracy. If the system doesn't make it attractive for citizens to stand, or for only certain types of citizens to stand, then that's a pretty fundamental flaw. And I think we do have some challenges in that regard. I mean, probably the most widely spoken, for good reason, is the gender inequality in Canberra and the environment that people talk about that, is not welcoming of women, not welcoming of families. But that goes well beyond women, I'd also say. I wouldn't stand because I still want to spend time with my family. I still want to have a life. And I don't want to be kind of harangued every day for putting a view out there or for not doing a good enough job or being uncertain about something. If you're part of a party machine that supports you and you've come up through the party ranks and you've got a big enough ego that you can withstand whatever, that's the kind of things that are incentivized, unfortunately. I still think I want to caveat a little bit because I think that through my professional life, I'm not talking about it so much directly now, but I have worked with, ministers and ministerial officers, and most of them, I guarantee you, are there for the right reasons and are trying to do good things. I've only worked as a apolitical bureaucrat, and I can see that they have political drivers that affect their decisions, and that's the nature of the work. But I definitely think that they put a lot of work in, and they probably don't get paid enough, to be honest, despite what you might hear. So I don't think
that is interesting, because when you were talking about the incentives for people to participate in our political process, I was thinking, well, the two real motivations are surely money, but compared to what people can earn in a corporate environment, what they get as a politician isn't actually that great. But power is the other factor.
Yeah.
They're not motivations that are going to attract necessarily ethical people.
I'm not sure it's completely as clear cut as it sounds. I think it's easy to be cynical, and I think you've got to have a pretty healthy ego. But you can have a pretty healthy, ego or commitment to the thing that you believe in, and that's what gets you through the days and days of online or offline abuse. I mean, I do think that if all you cared about was, power and money, there are much less painful ways of going about it. And so I think that it's not necessarily a clear line between, ego and power and wanting to, create the world and the vision that you see. And you might interpret that for someone you don't believe in, whose views you don't agree with, I should say, as being them just trying to get their way. But if it's someone you believe their views in, you'll see it as them, having a vision for the future and driving towards it. So a lot of it comes down to the perspective you're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely true. Good point.
Can I come back to something that you were sort of talking about before, which particularly came to my mind in the context of local government? You were saying that most people, I'm sure there are probably figures out there we could quote, but are not that engaged. Most people don't come to our Democracy for Dinner conversations. And, we had a conversation one night. We were meeting at Bistro Lola down the road, and I made everyone put their hand up and say, how many of you have eaten at the Cumberland Hotel in Castlemaine recently? How many of you even been in there recently? Like, there are plenty of people who still vote who just are not interested in the things that we're interested in. I think that's always a challenge for us to keep in mind.
And they don't even move in the same circles.
That's right. And we're in our bubbles. And I think, I don't blame people for having other things in their life that they're interested in and driven by. And when I had my first kid and my life was completely absorbed in that, there are things that are just right in front of you that you just have to deal with. And they're just personal choices. And I think the challenge that comes from that for democracy is the one that we started talking about, which is around being sufficiently informed and being sufficiently engaged. And what people end up doing if they're not engaged, and this is most people actually, not just those people who are engaged and disengaged, but particularly if you're not informing yourself, is that they vote, based on the team, and it's the spectator sport and identity. And there's a really good thinker from the US. He's a podcaster too. Look him up. Who's written about, his name Ezra Klein, who's written about polarization. And his view is that identity trumps self-interest every time for a voter. We might think that voters voting for their hip pocket, voting for tax cuts or whatever, but what most people are doing are voting for the team that best matches their identity. And that's essentially the main driver. Like, it's the same thing we hear in our echo chambers. I said a moment ago, maybe stopping the boats is not a bad idea because it will protect refugees from harm. But, if you were to say that kind of thing in a certain echo chamber, it sounds like you're not part of the team. You're from the other side. And that's what people are doing. They're kind of repeating things in a way that prove to the people that are around them that they're part of the team. And that doesn't really work for democracy. It ends up in the world like we've got in the US, where there just isn't any overlap between the sides. That is, the death spiral of democracy, and I'm not overstating it. I mean, there are researchers making those sort of predictions now.
Well, it's really interesting. I would love to unpack a bit. I mean, I've recently been rewatching The West Wing.
Right. I've never seen it, actually. People keep telling me.
Oh, it's so great.
Yes,
it's really good.
I know, it's one of my
beautifully
failings.
Written and fast-paced, and the language is brilliant and the characters are brilliant. Anyway, we've recently been rewatching that, and it's very idealistic as well, and very sort of left humanist, all of that stuff. But in Australia, and again, if people are just sort of passively consuming both their social media and their television stuff, there's a lot in Australia of us kind of not really knowing the difference between us and the US. And I've seen it in the language and rhetoric of the alt-right as well, as that emerges and grows in Australia. They're using American law language. They're using phrases that are used in America, but they don't actually apply in Australia. It's not true here. And I kind of worry that people just borrow their politics and don't think about it that much, about how fundamentally different Australian politics is.
Right.
And our democracy is really significantly different in some key ways.
Yeah.
And one of those, as I mentioned before, is compulsory voting. Another one is preferences. Are you able to explain a little bit some of the differences? There's so many different types of democracy across the world. So many different countries have got democracy, but a completely different brand.
Yeah.
But let's unpack a little bit the difference between Australia and America for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ones that probably isn't spoken about enough is the existence of the Australian Electoral Commission, which, is not particularly sexy, but is absolutely fundamental to having a fair system to start with. And that is foundational to the differences between us and the US. The US have their electoral authority is delegated to the state legislatures, and the state legislatures flip from, Democrat to Republican over time. And it's been particularly the case for the Republicans, but it's also been the case when Democrats have been in control that they have been found to have been gerrymandering the electorates. And, effectively, in the US now, both as a combination of the Senate system but also the gerrymandering of the House of Representatives, the Republicans only need to get around 42% of the vote to be in a majority.
So what does that mean, the gerrymandering?
It's a term that means you are amending the boundaries of the electorate to suit the party, to increase your chances of election.
So you might move the line of your electorate to include or exclude a particular town.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So what happens in Australia, so Bendigo electorate that we're in at the moment, is that the Australian Electoral Commission every year redraws the boundaries. Sometimes they scrap an electorate, sometimes they create a new electorate based on population and based on numbers. So roughly we have the same number of people in each electorate, and because people move.
So some of them in Western Australia would be vast in terms of geography.
Yep.
But it's roughly the same number of people are being represented within that area.
Yeah, that's right. So between the last federal election and this federal election, the Bendigo electorate has moved to include Woodend, which has been taken out of the McEwen electorate. They look then at the polling booths of Woodend from last time, and the predictions are done for next time. It'll be slightly more Labor now than it was before that boundary change. But that's all done by an independent commission of people whose job it is, with criteria to sit down and assess the numbers, and they don't look at will this benefit one party or another, whereas in the US they do look at how can I change this boundary so that it gives my party the chances for success. And it's become almost understood, and all of the electoral law in the US is delegated to the state, so it differs from state to state. So some states have stronger laws around what the state legislatures can do, but it's almost become understood that once you have a Republican legislature or once you have a Democrat legislature, then the next federal election or their presidential elections or House of Reps or Senate elections will be affected and prioritising that party that was in control. You look at the state houses, one election, then you look at the House of Reps in the next election, and that's partly why, this year in the US, for example, it's strongly predicted that there will be a Republican majority in the House of Reps, because there was a number of state legislatures that went to the Republican at the last election period. And the other side of that, which hopefully we don't have yet in Australia, but is also less an institution but more kind of a cultural norm, is that is becoming the understood practice. Everything is politicized, and everything is and it's just what happens. If you want to have a different group of people deciding the electoral laws, then vote them in at the state level, rather than what we have is an acceptance that you can have an independent body that will independently and apolitically make those determinations. There's still obviously an apolitical public service in the US, but the arguments around having an independent body in the US are that they can't see how you could have an independent body. They can see how you could have 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and maybe there's you alternate the chair of them, but it's still politicized. Like, it's gone away from the sense of, nobody is genuinely independent. You've all got a side, and that's. Yeah, and I think we have to kind of maintain that culture of expert neutrality, really, and that's fundamental.
And do you feel like that is a possibility, that one of the parties might stack the Electoral Commission with their own people somehow Do you know, if you want to get into conspiracy theories, our electoral commission is ripe for the picking.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't actually know off the top of my head how the electoral commission. I presume they're public servants, so they're not political appointees, which makes it a little bit easier. Even when this is not quite answering your question, but I'll come back to it. Even in Australia, where we have seemingly political appointments or nominations, for example, High Court judges that nominated by the Attorney General, those are still done in fairly apolitical ways, or slightly less political than the US, I should say. I mean, you get slightly more conservative judges from the coalition than you do from Labor. They pick judges that suit, but you're not picking a coalition judge to sit on the High Court in Australia, whereas in the US you genuinely are. And the Supreme Court's also become massively politicised, which is a major problem.
We're seeing that with the current Roe versus Wade.
Absolutely.
Been following that.
I mean, you can't avoid it. It's
everywhere.
That's completely unsurprising, as shocking as it is. Trump managed to nominate 2 or 3, I forget now, I haven't got in front of me, but 2 or 3 judges. A lot of presidents don't get to nominate any. So he was, incredibly lucky. And that was the long game it's literally called the long game in Mitch McConnell's autobiography, by the way. The long game that they were playing, like changing the structure to be conservative for a long time, as opposed to focusing on the short-term electoral cycles.
Because those people are in those high court positions for the rest of their life.
Yeah. In the US, in the Supreme Court in the US, they're lifetime tenures. So in Australia, on the Electoral Commission question, I still have pretty solid faith in the quality of the Australian bureaucracy. I think we've got good people in critical positions across both federal and state and local government, and it means that we can have an independent AEC, and we've got laws that go around it and things that they can and can't do, and all the rest of it, which gives a degree more confidence in it as well. I mean, to your question about could it be stacked, I think there are guardrails that would make that particularly difficult. I mean, you could have a government that decides to change the laws that govern the AEC, and this is where it comes down to culture and perception more widely. You would want to have enough robust appreciation for the AEC and other institutions across the populace that people would find that abhorrent if a government did try to change it. But at the same time, governments do stack the ABC board, for example, with political appointees, which is changing the nature of that entity as well. So, look, we've got a lot of things in place. We've learned from the US that you can't take these things for granted. And we talked about the disengagement point previously, which is not just disengagement from politics and elections, but I'm concerned about disengagement or lack of awareness of things like an independent, robust bureaucracy and the things like the Australian Electoral Commission. You've got to know that it's worthwhile to be worried about it going. And I worry that our knowledge of things like the value of the AEC is not where it should be.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Again, that thing that we all just trundle along on election day and feel like everything's fair. There's a lot of people contesting the results in America and in other democratic places. There's accusations of corruption and dishonesty and the voting not being fair. But we don't really have that as a worry here in Australia, do we? That the actual system of voting is open to corruption.
I mean, I think in the US there's been as long a history of complaints about the result as you might think. I mean, there's been a history of
the Trump administration, obviously.
Yeah, they used it as a political tool. They undermined the trust so that they could, if they lost, they could. It was pretty blatant. He said he was going to do that before the election. He did it, and who could be surprised? I mean, I wouldn't mind coming back to the language point, because I think we can overuse the language of corruption and things. On Trump, I think, back to my earlier point, I think that the people, to use an arbitrary scale, from what I've observed as a bureaucrat in other roles, I'd imagine that 80% of what is done, 85% is done in best interest by expert people doing a good job. But I think if you were to ask, particularly in the US and probably also in Australia, what people thought about the bureaucracy or about government, I'd imagine that they'd probably say it's about 20%. The rest of it's corrupt. The rest of it's self-interested, all the rest of it. And the problem with that is that someone like Trump can come in and he can reduce it from 85% right down to 20%, and people don't think anything's changed. I mean, their expectations are already so low that he can genuinely be corrupt and genuinely,
and people
rig
go,
the system.
What do you expect?
Yeah, that's right. It's always been like this. What are you talking about? And it's like, that's problem. And so, on the language point, we throw around words like corruption all the time. And I just think we have to be really careful with that language.
I mean, corruption is a hot topic at the moment in Australia. It has been for a while in terms of people calling for a federal level anti-corruption process, which we don't have.
Yeah, that's
currently.
Right. And so talking about what that is about, I'm not denying that there aren't pockets of bad behaviour in certain places, and we've seen that in various places around Australia, but not of a scale that we saw in, it's not even the same category as what Trump was up to. The sorts of things that an anti-corruption commission in Australia would do are the so-called sports rorts affair, or the allocation of grants for political means. So elected officials, whilst they're accountable ultimately to the public at elections and therefore, make decisions on those basis, they are still bound to be doing things in the public interest and of doing things in a way that is of, a good use of taxpayers' money. So if a politician is allocating public money to get their party back into power, that's not an efficient use of public money, and it's not in the public interest. So that's the kind of thing where it's not a crime and therefore the police can't charge them, but you could have an anti-corruption commission looking at the way that decisions are made and saying, actually, this was done for a political reason, not for a public good reason, and they need to be held to account. At the moment, there is a genuine gap between those things that are a federal crime and the AFP can already prosecute, and things that are just, bad behaviour, or even if there is legislation saying you need to do this in the public interest, there isn't any way to enforce that. And so, in my view, and I'm not a corruption expert, but it's that kind of thing that we need an anti-corruption commission for. It also is for, the brown paper bag or the influence of political lobbying and those sorts of things, and I don't deny that goes on. I think the difference is that the genuine both corrupt behaviour but also the destroying of norms that Trump went through is quite different from the sorts of things that we're necessarily talking about here. And again, it's not a clear cut. It's not as simple as, the influence of money in politics and the lack of transparency of political donations. Those sort of things are genuine problems in Australia as well. And it's not a clear line between some things are good and some things are bad. But I think we also need to be careful about sort of throwing around, so-and-so is corrupt or so-and-so is on the take. I had this debate with my 18-year-old recently where he told me that ScoMo's on the take. And I'm like, you can't say that. You can say that, but it's not helpful. What are you specifically talking about? What particular situation are you talking about? Because I think that what it does is it undermines the genuine trust. And if there are things that are wrong, then we need to name them and call them out. But if it's generalized, then it gets to that situation before where people's trust in institutions erode so much that we actually don't fight for them anymore. If people just started saying the AEC is corrupt, and I've seen tweets recently from members standing for Parliament who are saying the AEC is corrupt, and the AEC, basically tweeting back at them, good on them. But the problem with that is it undermines the trust. And so if a government was to come in and say, hey, we're reforming it, we're going to get rid of it, then people aren't going to fight for it. So that's why it's so important to be careful with what we're saying.
Yeah, I think from an environment point of view, there's been so many stories about they allocate X million dollars to a brand new organisation that's made up of all their friends who are going to save the Great Barrier Reef, but actually they're all linked to the coal and fossil fuels industries. Those sort of stories have been around. And even the pandemic recovery being pointed toward opening up new gas and fracking and all of that sort of stuff. That feels not like it's in the best interests of anyone. And there's that documentary that was made that I haven't watched that linked a lot of the liberal conservative kind of high politics people with having been in corporate roles in the fossil fuels industries and mining and things like that.
Yeah, look, I'm sure it happens. And I could point to plenty of documentaries that would probably say the same thing about Labor or the Greens or whatever from another side. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful about claiming facts from particular sources. So I agree with you that the case of the $250 million that went to a very small company on the Great Barrier Reef does sound a bit unusual. It does sound like something that should be looked at. I think my point is that should be looked at by something like an anti-corruption commission who has the tools to actually explore it and understand it, how decisions were made, how it got to that point.
But this is what we don't have, isn't it?
Correct.
We don't have the anti-corruption
commission. I think that's a really good idea. I think having that for these purposes is a really good idea. And so I think in absence of it, we have these things litigated, around...
These vacuums of information and lots of speculation.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And look, I've seen things that look from the outside like they're really bad, but actually not. And if you understand the decision-making process, I just think it's there and there are problems. We need to have the institutions to properly understand them and to stamp them out, because I think that if it's litigated across social media or around the Democracy for Dinner table, for argument's sake, whatever it is, usually with a bunch of people who agree with you, and it's not necessarily going to get you the answer. So I think these are the things that I guess are foundational to democracy working.
Now, look, we've only got 8 more minutes before you have to disappear. I just was wondering if there was anything you wanted to say, particularly coming back to Democracy for Dinner, and there's a couple of other local initiatives about people sort of self-educating and becoming more consciously engaged with the political process. Is there anything else you would say around that? Or how can Australians who might be feeling increasingly cynical or suspicious actually investigate this stuff? How can they actually learn what the truth of these things is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think back to the original premise of the Dinner for Democracy, which became Democracy for Dinner, mainly through a typo, by the way, which he thought was funny and therefore decided to keep. It was about the burden of being an informed citizen. That was Jodie's tagline when she said, hey, how would this do this thing? Like, it's the burden of democracy. It actually takes a bit of work, and that's a hard thing to ask people to do when they've got busy lives and doing all the rest of it. So some of it takes work, but I also think that it's about what I was saying before about just being willing to kind of stop and listen and learn a little bit before you jump to conclusions about something. I think that we've all kind of seen the campaign on Facebook that we think is a really bad thing and, clicked whatever. It's just we need to know more about the things that we are engaging with, and maybe just imagining the best possible explanation that someone has a different view for you, and then engaging with that as opposed to continuing to engage with one's mindset about what the other side might be thinking. So in terms of like how we act or how we behave in a more prosaic sense, we do need more people putting up their hand. We need more people kind of actively engaging. We often have local government wards in Mount Alexander that are elected unopposed, which is, not great for democracy. I mean, we need people learning a bit and voting where they can, or participating outside of that. I mean, we haven't even touched on the strength of volunteering and committing to a cause and getting behind things that really matter to you and contributing that way.
So voting with your time and energy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, things like climate. I mean, we've waited so long for genuine political leadership on those sorts of things. But also heard Bob Brown speak recently. He said he didn't think he'd be championing the cause of the corporate sector as much as he is now, because they're actually leading on a lot of the climate stuff because the governments have been left behind. So just to think about driving things that we get behind, there's a lot more to creating change and influence than just your vote, as important as the vote is.
That's exactly why I started this podcast and radio show, is because of a deep frustration with our federal government. And I think the Liberals had just gotten in power and it was a very depressing time. And it was like, well, we're just going to have to do it ourselves. And I know that there's so many people who are active in the environment movement who are doing it because that's all we can do and we just have to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it is these people who are putting pressure on corporations, and the corporations are starting to see the writing on the wall about what it means for their business. If they're projecting their business models into 5, 10, 15, 20-year plans, they have to account for climate change.
Yeah.
And I think when they really look at what that means, it's scaring the bejesus out of them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, Adani didn't not go ahead or hasn't been built because lack of approvals. It was because the pressure was put on the financing of the banks and that actually have influenced that. And I think the question about climate and democracy is an interesting one. I went to China just before the pandemic, actually went through Wuhan, different story, but like in October, just before it all, no one heard of Wuhan at that point. And China it was fascinating to me to see what China was doing in electric buses and electric vehicles and all the rest of it, because they don't have to worry about the polarised political environment.
Two-party, oppositional.
It's, there is an argument to say you could get action on climate change much more quickly if you had autocracy, not democracy. But the obvious problem with that is that you get action that doesn't benefit everybody. It's that kind of climate justice side of things. We need both. We need democracy, which provides the accountability to the people. Otherwise, you could have action, but action in a way that isn't accountable to the people and doesn't drive that justice. So I think that's where those two things, in my mind, come together.
Yeah. And I think it's the luck of the draw when you have autocracy or a dictatorship, which way it'll fall, whether it will actually be for the people or for the climate or, it's tricky. I mean, if you have a dictatorship in the Middle East, they're going to be
that's right,
extracting all the oil
it's not my preferred
making people drive cars.
That's right. That's right. That's why I don't think it's easy to see that could be the case, but I don't think it's the best model going forward.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I offer one last thing before I go? So I mentioned my hero Ezra Klein. At the end of his podcast, he always asks people to recommend 3 books. So I was going to recommend 3 books, and they're all kind of American-based. I'll move on to Australian democracy next. But one is Ezra's book, Why We're Polarised. We haven't talked about media, and media feeds on the disengaged, and people start to just believe the narrative that they see, and it just creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So he's got a book all about political polarisation called Why We're Polarised. There's another one by a couple of academics called Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, which is called How Democracies Die, and it's a really good read. It's quite frightening, really easy to read. It's quite frightening, and written during Trump's term in office, and they essentially go through, so they've been researching dictatorships and autocracies for decades, and they go through their well-established framework of here are the indicators, and Trump essentially ticks off 8 out of 10 or something like that of those indicators, and there's only been one other president who's ever had any indicator, and he only had one, and that was Nixon. So Trump was like, and this is the example of, Hillary versus Trump, like they're not even the same ballpark. And then the third one, which goes back to a passion for trusted institutions and bureaucracy and all the rest of it. And another American book, actually there's an Australian equivalent too, but I'll talk about it, which is called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. So Michael Lewis is a pretty famous kind of non-fiction author and podcaster, and his book Big Short became a movie, and he's had Moneyball and a few others that are pretty famous, but he wrote The Fifth Risk, which he described as his love letter to the bureaucracy. So he went into a number of agencies during the Trump years and just interviewed people who were keeping the lights on, keeping the world running in spite of the chaos above them, people who are stopping toxic waste dumps from going into rivers, and people who are running the weather service, and people who are doing all this sort of stuff. And there is a real risk that we don't appreciate how much of what we see as our good life is dependent on a solid public service. It's not the
people doing the 9 to 5
exactly
behind a computer doing
all that. And it's not quite the same, but James Button's book Speechless, which is about his time working for Kevin Rudd, is also really interesting because he's an outsider. He comes from a political family but never worked in the public service, and goes and works, Rudd basically chews him up and spits him out, but then he goes to work in the public service itself, and he's like, there's so many more people trying to do a really good job here than I thought. I thought it was just a whole lot of people getting paid lots of money to sit around and do nothing. And just the kind of insights into, if we don't appreciate that, then we won't fight for it if it gets taken away from us.
Yeah, so great. Thank you for those recommendations. I love that. Any other final points?
I think that's good.
There would be, that whole conversation about Hillary versus Trump would be excellent to delve into, but it's been analysed to death.
There is a really good David Sedaris take on this, which is that, David Sedaris, the humour writer, he's a very funny writer in the US. Anyway, he talks about, if you're on an aeroplane and they come up to you and say you can either choose the chicken or the piece of shit with ground up glass in it, you don't ask how well the chicken's cooked. That's the choice you're making, basically. It's like, you don't criticize the chicken when the other alternative is as bad as it is. So.
But coming back to that polarization point, I feel like the American public was so polarized and so cynical at that point that they felt like a protest vote was a better thing to do than to vote for the piece of chicken.
That's right. Yeah, I mean,
That's dangerous. That's a symptom, really.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that a lot of people didn't think that Trump was going to get in, and so they probably weren't that, the Democrat side wasn't that wound up by it, and a lot of them weren't that excited by Clinton, and that affected it. There's also, we didn't talk about, and there's a whole list of things that are different between us and the US, and we only really touched on one of them, but you mentioned preferential voting. That wouldn't have happened, and Bush versus Gore wouldn't have happened in a system which had preferential voting, because you would have had, in the case of Bush versus Gore, you would have had Ralph Nader's votes largely going to Gore and pushing him over the line, and Jill Stein in the Clinton versus Trump. Imagine that could have affected a handful of states. So the Senate's different again in that it's proportional representation as opposed to preferential voting, and that means that you actually genuinely do get minor parties elected for good reason. The Senate as proportionate to the vote. So if, I forget what the actual quota is for the Senate now, but this is how you get people who are representative of 10 to 15% of the population can get a seat, because that's large enough to warrant a seat. Tasmania and New Zealand have this for their lower houses. So in Tasmania, there is proportional representation across their lower houses as well for the state parliament. And it means this is why, Tasmania was the first state that had a Labor Green Accord way back in the early 90s. So, and New Zealand has proportional representation across all of them. They also have a Maori seat in Parliament. So there are a whole range of ways of doing things which mean that you can reflect the overall population better than you do in a two-party system. So preferential is better than not preferential, but there are other ways that would actually fully represent the community. And then we'll create the sort of thing that the Prime Minister is currently complaining about, literally on radio today, about having a diverse Parliament, which, is not an easy thing, and you can see challenges in places like Israel and other places where they have significant challenges even forming government. But in a lot of Europe, coalition governments, but not like we have in Australia between Liberal and the National Party, but coalitions between parties to reach a majority is the norm. In Germany, the Green Party has just joined with the Social Democrats Party and a slightly more right-wing party, which means that some things...
So it lends itself to cooperation rather than division.
Which is easier said than done. It's interesting, I mentioned Ezra before. He has a different view from the US, where the problem in the US is that they don't have enough of a majoritarian system. The party that gets the majority can't always get its agenda through. And so they have the filibuster, and they have a range of, I think there's some research I saw which had 14 checks and balances on any decision that are made, like presidential veto and a whole range of other things. We have a handful of them, 3 or 4, which is healthy to have checks and balances. In the US, you have kind of 14 ways that something can be stopped. And the problem with that is that you can vote, a blue wave, or you can vote a red wave, and they actually don't get their agenda in. So you can't actually see what having a majoritarian party delivering its agenda looks like. And so people get cynical and think nothing's happened, and then they do a protest vote. So he has a view that you can have too much of that kind of deliberation and compromise, which is interesting, because I think we see it from the other side. It feels like, we don't have enough of that. And, there have been minority governments that have worked pretty well. I think Labor Party in Tasmania would probably not like to go back to Labor Green Accord, but there actually was some really fantastic things that came out of that period, and the Gillard government with Tony Windsor, another example of where that collaboration can actually work really well.
So that's it for my conversation with Bryn Davies. It felt like we'd only just got started, really, but there is so much to talk about politics and the world. If you live in Castlemaine, I highly recommend that you check out Democracy for Dinner and the event they're putting on Wednesday night, which is a Meet the Candidates event on the 11th of May. It's at the Tap Room, and if there is a recording available after the event, I'll link it in the podcast notes. So go to saltgrasspodcast.com for that link, and also links to all of the other things that Bryn spoke with us about today. You can follow Saltgrass on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. Please subscribe to our email list to get reminders and updates about the show. And again, you can do that by going to saltgrasspodcast.com. This program is made possible with support from Main FM and the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. My name is Alison Hanley. Thanks for listening.
Salt of the earth. Salt. 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 Grassroots. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change.
Saltgrass. Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.